Part 3. African Americans, the Nadir of Race Relations. Historian Rayford Logan famously called the period between 1877 through the early 20th century the nadir of race relations, referring to the lowest point in the relations between whites and blacks, or conversely, to the apex of racism, exemplified by the unabashed discrimination, racism, and violence of the period. 3.1. The Rise of Jim Crow. After Reconstruction and the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendments, Black Americans were still not accepted as first-class citizens. Besides racial discrimination and increasing segregation, they also endured hardships resulting from the competition of European and Asian immigrants. In spite of the growing presence of immigrants from different cultural backgrounds, African Americans struggled in American society, remaining the perennial other. The Southern Black Codes of 1865 and 1866, which had prohibited free movement of black laborers, forbidden interracial marriage, and strongly induced strict regulation of labor contracts, paved the way for Jim Crow, which was another name for segregation. In the 1880s, the Southern states' legislatures passed laws known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a derogatory name for blacks. Its origins are a minstrel figure of the 1830s. These laws aimed at separating the two races, and they were the official expression of segregation. The hypocritical argument justifying these laws was that separating blacks from whites was a social necessity that did not violate political equality. Thus, the Jim Crow laws established segregation in train stations, in public transportation, in schools, restrooms, churches, restaurants, hotels, theaters, and even in cemeteries. In courts, blacks and whites swore on separate Bibles, and interracial marriages were forbidden. Of course, inequality, not equality, characterized this process. Black housing in schools, their conditions of transportation, the public places reserved to them were usually inferior than their white counterparts. In the 1890s, the Southern states' legislatures also tried hard to exclude blacks from the polls. As they could not pass laws explicitly barring African Americans from voting, they adopted several strategies such as the poll tax, which obliged the citizens to pay in order to vote, but unfortunately it excluded the poor of both races. The literacy tests that required voters to read and interpret a passage of the Constitution, which excluded again both black and white illiterate men, or the grandfather clause, stating that the man who had voted in 1866 did not have to take the literacy test or pay a tax on property. Of course, as no black person had voted at that time, this was before Congress applied its radical plan granting equal voting rights to former slaves, it led to a dramatic decrease in the number of black voters. As Southern Democrats slowly regained control of the South in the 1890s and strove to overthrow both white Northern Republican rule and what they feared was a growing black political power, the period saw peaks of lynching and the first federal ruling on segregation in public transportation in 1896, with Plessy v. Ferguson establishing the separate but equal doctrine. 3.2. The impact of the war, the lost cause. The lost cause is both a discourse and a set of practices that developed in the South out of grief after the defeat of the Confederacy. At its heart is a full-blown myth, the myth of a glorious organic civilization destroyed by an avaricious and industrial society, the North, determined to wipe out its culture. The people who believed in the lost cause could not reconcile their past to the budding ideology of the New South with its industrialism, and believed that the South had become a slave in the hands of Northern banks. Before the 1880s, the tone of the lost cause was generally mournful, an expression of grief. In the 1880s, a shift occurred towards a reconciliationist attitude, a blue for the Yankee uniform, gray, Confederate fraternalism. Then in the 1890s comes a more celebratory movement with the erection of several statues of Confederate heroes such as Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis, former president of the Confederacy. Some Southern popular novelists participated in the discourse of the lost cause by developing or prolonging fictional types and stereotypes. The revisionist trend of the lost cause helped to perpetuate the image of the slaves as docile, loyal, and childlike, content in his fate, and therefore not possibly the cause of the war. This is the Sambo figure, which would later be theorized by historian Stanley Elkins in these words, quote, "The docile but irresponsible, loyal but lazy, humble but chronically given to lying and stealing, full of infantile silliness, whose relationship with his master was one of utter dependence and childlike attachment." End of quote from Stanley Elkins in 1959. Slavery, a Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life. Now, this was part of the reconciliationist mood, which was most particularly visible in the literary genre that flowered in the 1880s, published by magazines in the North and in the South, and that derived more or less from the plantation tradition. Many popular stories that were then published featured intersectional marriages, that is, a Northern man marrying a Southern woman, or vice versa, as symbols of this much sought-after reconciliation. At the heart of this myth was the legend of the antebellum Golden Age of the South, where race relations had been supposedly harmonious and the master always benevolent. The popular authors of this type of literature in the South included Thomas Nelson Page or Joel Chandler Harris with his very popular figure Uncle Remus. 3.3 Coons and Beasts, Retrogression and Lynchings. We should note that the term Jim Crow comes from an early 19th century caricature, a stereotype developed on stage by actor Thomas Dartmouth Rice in the 1820s. In the wake of Jim Crow, there appeared another major black stage figure named Zip Coon. While Jim Crow was in tatters and rags, an example of the Sambo happy-go-lucky figure and a rural character, Zip Coon was more of an urban black dandy. Rice and his Jim Crow were part of early minstrelsy, with white actors performing in blackface, mimicking and mocking African American vernacular. The coon songs and minstrel shows really developed in the United States in the post-Civil War era. The derogatory use of the term coon for black Americans did not come in widespread use until the early 1880s. But the coon songs were a veritable craze in the 1880s for over a decade, depicting blacks as watermelon lovers and chicken thieves. By and by, many coon songs did not only feature the happy-go-lucky, loyal Sambo or darky, but more ominous figures sporting razors, devoid of honesty or personal honor, and given to drunkenness. They were also lazy, a clear sign of their being devoid of the WASP work ethics, and almost always sensuous and libidinous. Portraying blacks as dangerous, served to justify segregation, served to justify the control of black people. This was an obvious effect of the post-1877 turn to more dangerous and threatening black figures in the collective imagination.